Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's live virtual panels. Today we will be discussing cybersecurity and automated vehicles, which is a rich and fascinating topic. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I am the Communications Director for PAVE. And I'm joined today by three just the perfect people to discuss cybersecurity and automated vehicles. First, I'd like to welcome Anuja Sonalker. She's the CEO and founder of SteerTech. Hey, Anuja.
Hi, nice to be here.
And Jeff Davis. Jeff is the Senior Director for Government Relations and Public Policy at BlackBerry. Jeff, welcome.
It's great to be here.
And we have Dr. Bradley Potteiger. He is currently an embedded exploitation researcher and member of the Institute for Assured Autonomy at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Bradley, welcome.
Thanks, Ed. It's good to be here.
So I'm so glad we're all here to discuss this topic because it's one of the ones that I think generates some of the anxiety that people have around automated vehicles. I think there's something about the idea of handing over control that somehow makes the idea of losing control to someone else that much scarier. And so I'm hoping we can address that and some of the other issues around cybersecurity and automated vehicles today. I did learn quite a while ago when I was a cub reporter first covering cybersecurity that really the first thing that you should always ask about cybersecurity is, what's the real threat? Who is it's, and the term I think is threat modeling, but I think my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it's always important to understand first what is the threat before you really get into the nuts and bolts. So let's start. Jeff, we'll start with you. I want to get each of your sort of perspective on this because I think there are potentially different ways to look at it. Jeff, who might want to hack a vehicle or an automated vehicle, and feel free to get into the differences there, although we'll explore that more later. But who would want to hack a vehicle and why?
So I think you got a list of different actors, but I think you hit the nail on the head with threat modeling. You really want to look at this from a risk perspective. So you could look at any sort of bad actors, from criminal all the way up to state or state-sponsored actors that might have interest in hacking a vehicle. And the first thing that everybody talks about, and the thing that I think scares everybody, is where people like to discuss this from a worst case scenario. It's somebody hacks into an autonomous vehicle, which becomes the scariest one of all, right? Because it could potentially drive that vehicle or control that vehicle remotely and cause a major incident, kill people on the highways, what have you. But when you really model that out, the risk of that happening, first of all, the level of technology and technological understanding to get to that point to where you can actually get that type of access into a vehicle is pretty hard. So really what you're looking at is your state level, and you're expecting them to now do something that's actually tantamount to an act of war, right? So that's not something that you're going to see a state do, and there's a lot easier ways for them actually to go ahead and start a war with the United States than to go ahead and do it that way. Where I actually see capability or the ability to actually perform an attack and the motivation to do the attack, where I see those two really converging together the most, is in the criminal realm. We continue to put payment systems into vehicles. We continue to put our personal life into our vehicles. And the more that we do that, that won't change with autonomous vehicles, because as we look at modeling for autonomous vehicles or business modeling for it, we're really looking towards something that's going to look very much like a MOS or mobility on demand type model, which means that payment systems are going to inherently be a part of it. Personal identification will be a part of it. And that's where you have some very clever and very intelligent criminals who've already figured out how to do this. They figured out how to do it on our phones. They figured out how to do it from our laptops. They figured out how to do it from everywhere. Doing it from a car is just one more step in that. And that's really where I see the major danger moving forward right now. That's probably the biggest point where risk meets motivation.
Yeah. Brad?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And I would just add one other point to that. So to go off what Jess said, we can see parallels with the healthcare industry. So in healthcare and hospitals, you can see a lot of these ransomware attacks and data exfiltration. Your car is essentially another version of a computer. There's millions of lines of code. There's tons of different devices connected to it. And it's a very good resource for attackers to be able to exfiltrate personal identified information from. In terms of the nation state hackers, I would say one of the most probable types of attacks is probably more of like a stealthy like attack. So obviously, as Jeff said, they're not going to try to overtly start a war with us, but they may try to stay under the radar and stay in the shadows and start doing these propagating effects. So if they can hack into 10 cars in New York City and slow them down by maybe 10 miles an hour without anybody noticing, you can start having these propagating effects, and you can start to see huge amounts of congestion and chaos within cities with very little effort.
And who would be sort of attempting to carry out that kind of?
Yes, that would be more of the nation state actors, but also you can think of political hacktivists like Anonymous as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things. There's so many potential motivations. Yeah, Anuja, go ahead.
I think that you have to think of it from an attacker perspective, but also an asset perspective. You know, why would somebody want to hack a car is the same reason why would somebody want to break into your house. So you predominantly, if you start right at the top, very high level, right? There's 2 or 3 different reasons why somebody would want to hack your car. One is to cause physical damage, either to the vehicle or to the surroundings. And the second one is the data and stealing and monetizing that. And the third one is for research purposes, you know. So if you divide that up like that, the kind of attacks would be one for intellectual curiosity, and you know, to deliver better systems protection or whatever. These are the white hat hackers. These are the people who predominantly are doing this because they want to make systems better, and bug bounty programs work most effectively for such kind of groups of people, you know. And the second one is those who want to cause actual physical damage, loss of life, property, you know. They're driven by terrorism and that kind of an agenda is nefarious purposes like that. And then the third kind of attacks is where you want to steal data or information and you want to monetize and mine it. This is by far the most sophisticated group of attackers, because they have access to a lot of sophisticated tools, resources, corporate espionage. It could be for political gain. It could be for syndicated crime networks, you know, like Jeff mentioned. So they have a lot of monetary assets backing them up, and they have a lot of money to generate off of these. So those are another kind of attack. And the fourth one is my favorite kind, which is Trojanizing. So the target is not actually the vehicle. The target is another larger IoT system, but you're using the vehicle to piggyback off of the car and getting access to infrastructure, the electric grid, or, you know, the national grid, or things like that. You're using this vehicle as a door to enter and then become an insider in and a legitimate participant in a much larger IoT system. So those are how you can classify. In my books, I classify it like that.
Right. So it's safe to say there's sort of a really wide potential range, but of threats out there, but the level of sophistication that is required tends to limit that. Is that sort of a safe way of thinking about this? And that's sort of the lower, and actually this brings me to sort of the next thing. You know, just 5 days ago, there's a report here of 500,000 BMW, Mercedes, and Hyundai owners hit by a data breach. So some of this stuff is happening now, and it seems like those financial motivations are the most common, but you know, that seems to be mostly focused on sort of data, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is it because that's sort of the easiest way to make money through hacking is through personal data, versus someone want to?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say probably the easiest way is to get the data, but as we see more ransomware attacks within the automotive domain, I can see that playing a big part as well.
Okay, and just for people who don't understand what ransomware is, could you just explain that really quickly?
Yeah, so essentially what ransomware is the attacker puts a piece of malicious code on your system. And what that code does is it basically encrypts all of your file with a specific key. And so what the attacker does after that is they basically request payment, and frequently it's Bitcoin or some type of other currency for the key to then unlock your systems. And they often demand, if you don't pay by a certain time, then they'll delete all your files. So when you get these large enterprises like hospitals or automotive or governments, They have huge amounts of data, and if they lose that data, their company goes under. So that's usually how they bring them to the table and hold them hostage to be able to get paid at the end of the day.
Yeah. And so in addition to this most recent data breach, which is not by any stretch the only one, you know, in general, let alone in the auto industry, you know, we've also all probably heard of, you know, some of the hacks that were done by sort of the white hat hackers. I think most famously the Jeep hack from a few years back. So Jeff, I want you to help us understand, you know, if some of these what seem to be the most common kinds of hacking, data breach and some others are already happening with human controlled cars, does adding automation to cars actually increase the risk? Does it increase maybe the opportunities to attack? Is it easier to take control? How does the automation affect you know, this problem versus sort of the vehicles that we have on the road right now?
So I think it actually depends on how we tackle it. And I actually think Bradley and Anuja could answer this pretty well when I'm done, and love to hear their thoughts on it as well. But so there's a few things. One, if you look at it from, so just with access or ability to hack, again, what you're looking at depends on the amount of access that you're actually giving to the car, and that's creating the vectors now, right? So if vehicles are connected, that's a vector for a bad actor to get in. If you plug in your phone to the vehicle, your phone connects to the vehicle when you get in, that's another way for a hacker to gain access to that vehicle. Does it become more dangerous or more costly? I think it can become more costly very quickly, because when you look at the business models that you move forward with, and you're looking at shared mobility across the board with automated vehicles, if you look at that model, inherently within that model means that you are putting more and more personal data into that single vehicle, right? So everybody who's using that vehicle is now putting, at some point, storing their own personal data or somehow identifying themselves and a payment system personally to that. So that can become a problem. It can become a problem for ransomware. It can also just become a problem for just straight out theft. The other thing that you can look at with it is that as the machine has more access to controls of the vehicle, yes, it could become more dangerous. You know, is there an aspect that that somehow a hack that was meant to just be a ransomware attack could cause a problem with the inner workings of the car? It's unlikely, but possible. But anytime you do that, of course, you open up the risk base, and you open up really where the vectors are, the more that you give access to the car. So, yeah. And with that, I'd love to hear Bradley or Anuja.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely think another vector as well is the vehicle to infrastructure communication. So not only can you get into a vehicle by, for example, the OBD port or cellular or Wi-Fi, you're also going to have intelligent infrastructure as well. So whether it's traffic lights, speed detectors, there's going to be so many different vectors to get into these cars. Obviously, that's going to increase the risk, but I think the biggest risk to the car is the fail-safe at the end of the day. Because if you have a human-driven car and someone hacks into your system, you still have that human element that can take over at the end of the day and break the car and maintain safety of the vehicle. Now, when you have a truly autonomous vehicle, it's fully autonomously controlled. So there's no human backup. If the controller fails, it's going to crash. So when we develop these systems, we need to make sure that there's fail-safes that can take over in the event of these malicious activities.
Yeah.
So I agree with both Jeff and Bradley. I think they nailed the points. I come from just a slightly different perspective, and it's common to them, but I just, I'll share the perspective, because we build autonomous vehicles, purpose-driven autonomous vehicles, and we do the cybersecurity. So at this intersection point, I can certainly tell you that it's very hard to generalize. all AVs that are, or ADS systems that are on road and used today are purpose built. They are all built to serve a particular purpose and cannot be generalized. So the answer also, it's hard to generalize. But I would say if you divided it up, kind of like what they said, if you divide it up into physical attacks and data type of attacks, right? So from a physical attacks perspective, automated vehicles are actually more vulnerable than human vehicles. And I'll separate it into, I won't call it driverless and driver vehicles. I will call it human vehicles and non-human based vehicles, because for example, like the Neuros and the steers, Neuro is delivering goods and there is no human inside, whereas driverless could mean the passenger is still sitting in the back seat, so there's still a human in the vehicle. So I'll separate it like human and no human kind of automated vehicles.
Yep.
If there is no human in the loop, in the vehicle at all, then really the vehicle is not generating very rich data that is relevant to an attacker, like a syndicated crime network and ransomware and all. They don't care, right? If there is a human involved, then there's very rich data that is being generated. And so the data aspect, those attacks are more common where there is a human. So whether it's a automated vehicle with a human sitting in the back or a human driven vehicle, they are more valuable for those kind of attacks. The physical attacks is where there is no human in the loop, because that means the vehicle is highly automated, number one. And number two, a human serves as a purpose to air gap the system. When you have a human in the vehicle, you can actually leverage that in your security properties, in your security architecture, and you can actually create an air gap system where the human is bridging that air gap for you.
And can you just explain what air gapping is, just in case there's anyone who doesn't understand?
A physical air gap means between a system, there is no way to get from one side to another side without bridging that gap physically. So you have like a, you have a mountain and another mountain, and there's a big valley in between. You need something to jump across. It's literally like that. That's a physical air gap. So you can use a human to physically air gap a system. So for example, if a system does not have remote ignition, you need a human to press the button to start the vehicle, to turn it on to, that's an air gap, right? Because now if two vehicles are at rest and one is an automated vehicle and one is a human vehicle, you cannot start that human vehicle and launch a physical attack because it's air gapped. Very simple example like that. So that's the main difference. I think for physical attacks, the AVs actually pose a much richer attack surface and more easy to go after that, to launch a physical attack. For data-based attacks, the AVs, the best they will generate for you is location data and that kind of data. So it's not really that valuable unless they're carrying very valuable cargo.
Yeah. So air gapping is sort of one of the issues that came up, I think, also in that Miller and Valasek GPAC, right? Because they were able to access the infotainment unit. And then Brad, why don't you explain sort of maybe what happened there?
Yeah. So essentially what happened, and for some context before this, basically the only way that people thought you could hack a car is by breaking a window, by hot wiring it, traditional vectors. Now, what they did was that basically they used the cellular communication from the radio, and they got into the infotainment center by finding a memory corruption or a buffer overflow vulnerability. Now, once they did that, because this network wasn't air gapped, they could pivot to pretty much any safety critical infrastructure within the car. In this case, they had their friend driving the car on a highway. So they were doing everything from turning up the radio, to speeding up the car, to braking the car, to turning on the windshield wipers, and even locking the doors. And basically they freaked out their friend. Now, the larger problem of this is the first time that people in the public started realizing, like, wait, someone can hack their car from their living room. Like, this isn't supposed to happen. So this is where the research really, really started in academia, to try to look at what are the vectors and also how we protect against them. The one addition I'd make to their research now in the last year or two has been the addition of AI, or artificial intelligence. So what they did is a traditional cybersecurity attack, but now in the academic world, what you're starting to see is that people are starting to reverse engineering the artificial intelligence controllers of these vehicles. And they, for example, can patch a stop sign to look like a speed limit sign. So instead of stopping, the car is actually tricked to speed up really fast and eventually crash into another car or the wall. So this is going to be another layer that I think people need to start looking at in terms of how do you make these AI algorithms more resilient.
So that's a really interesting example that these I think adversarial is often how those are described, because it seems to me, and Jeff or Anuja jump in here, but it seems like it's potentially really hard to protect against because it takes advantage of just the system working the way it's supposed to work. But on the other hand, maybe the motivations for these attacks are not going to make them widespread, because so you make a car miss a stop sign. How do you get anything other than maybe chaos out of it? I don't know. What do you think? Anuja, you want to take this, or Jeff?
This is an attack that is research quality. So this is something you can prove in theory that yes, this can happen, but it has very little practical value for somebody to launch an attack like this. Hackers in general are lazy people. They are looking for the lowest hanging fruit. They are looking for the fastest return on their investment, which is their time and their resources. So these kind of attacks really don't serve their purpose. It is also, they are very hard to launch in practice, because first of all, the vehicle needs to be in motion. You have to be able to be right place, right time with respect to that vehicle, to be able to get that input delivered to its sensors, to the cameras, to be able to see there is a stop sign there and now you're fudging with that. So the practical underlying difficulties associated with a hacker successfully launching that kind of attack, the barrier is high. Yeah. So you have to remember that hackers want the lowest barrier. They want those, right? So it is possible to do what this is, and there are a lot of research papers and academia has shown these, but practical quality for that is lower.
Well, and at Steer, I mean, you're developing autonomous systems, and I know sensor diversity can oftentimes be one of those things when one sensor has a weakness that can be exploited. Is that harder with something like a stop sign, just because you need that visual element, or is that something that having diverse sensor modalities might help you be less vulnerable to these kinds of attacks?
Diverse sensor modalities always help. So triple redundancy with sensors will help you, cross-check your sensor data. Maps. So for example, the stop sign is a very visual thing. Your radar and your ultrasonics will not pick it up. No other sensor will pick it up, but your maps can show you that there is a stop sign at this point. So that's two different sources of input that will tell you, and you can cross-check right there. So yes, absolutely. It is always, you never take one input from somewhere and you full 100% trust on that. So yeah.
Jeff,
I actually agree with Anuja on this one. I was going to say, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I agree with 100% on this. I mean, the level of complexity that it takes to actually spoof a sensor it's up there, and it goes to that, who has that ability and what do they really get out of it. I would say that the thing to concentrate on more, especially as you start talking about sensors, and I think Bradley brought it up very well, which was vehicle to infrastructure communications. The infrastructure tends to be extremely vulnerable. And that's really a spot right there that if you want to look at a vulnerable vector for an automobile, that's probably one of the more vulnerable vectors. That should in no way deter us from looking at connected vehicles, but what it should do is it should start shaping where we should start paying some of our attention to how we protect the vehicles.
And just to stick with that for a moment, what would you need to do to secure sort of that vehicle to infrastructure, or even potentially vehicle to vehicle type of communication, which again, still here, at least in this country, is not widespread, certainly at this point.
Right, and I think well, number one, it actually starts with something that goes into, and you could get very, very deep into the discussion with it, but it all literally starts with supply chain security. You have to start with, are you actually protecting this at the chip level? And that gets more into where you look at your state actors and things along those lines, because you can deal with, with espionage issues and insider threats that can go back into supply chains. The next step from there is really making sure the system is actually secured physically. I mean, some of the problems with the current transportation system, the current systems within the infrastructure, is that they're not physically secured. It's very easy to break into them. So somebody physically getting to a stoplight and being able to meander their way into the system through that is a risk and is a threat. From there, I believe you've now secured the hardware, you've secured the software, making sure that you put the right type of software in there. But then from there, what you have to do is really create a zero trust type of environment, and so creating a zero trust architecture, which means that from point to point, everything, even within the system itself, and when it has external communications between endpoints, you're validating each one of those communications and you're checking for anomalies at each one of the endpoints. So even if something is coming, you're validating the source every time. After the source has been validated, what the source is sending you is still not trusted, right? So at that point, it is zero trust. You then make sure that that package that's being sent is not acting or does not have some sort of anomalous behavior that's happening with it. And then continuously monitoring that system itself.
Yeah.
Ed, can I step in real quick?
Please.
So this kind of gets into what we often talk to as defense in depth approaches. So in autonomous vehicles, there's different layers of security protection. So what Jeff is talking about is a network level protection. But there's also physical protections like supply chains. There's application protections like firewalls, endpoint clients. And then there's data protections, which is like user authentication. So essentially it's like a big onion. There's different layers that have different niches of what they protect against. And the idea is if you have multiple complementary protections, then you're going to be able to have the best effect against stopping the majority of attacks. Now, one of the interesting things that's coming up in academia, in addition to looking at monitoring and endpoint clients and trying to detect suspicious activity, is the concept of moving target defense. And this kind of gets to what Anuja was talking about in terms of redundancy and resiliency of applications. So with moving target defense, instead of sitting back and waiting for the attacker to find a vulnerability into your system, you essentially diversify and randomize all these underlying parameters of your operating system so that at any given time, attackers can't discover vulnerabilities in your system. And if you have this unpredictability layer in your operating system and in your vehicles, then it starts to have a economical incentive. So maybe the attacker, when Anuja was talking about, they always try to take the path of least resistance. They may go on to another target instead of looking at you. Since a lot of the major attacks are general attacks, so if you think of Stuxnet, if you think of WannaCry ransomware, if you just have this diversity layer, it's going to mitigate against these large-scale, widespread attacks.
Yeah.
Good. I'll add something very quick in there. It is a great approach, moving target defense. I have seen it successfully used in static systems, in enterprise systems, and etc. But in cars, I will just say put a star on it because it's very, very hard. You have to think about your target system. In automotive, we have the additional challenge that parts come and parts go, right? So you have to replace a part. Something is going to wear and tear, you replace a part. Now you have crypto material in that part. You change that part. How is that new part going to function with the rest of the other parts in the system? You have to think about that. So that's a dealer problem. That's an OEM problem. That's on the supply chain and on the factory line when you build these and you're commissioning the system, that crypto material, when it was activated, it's a problem. It is a problem that you pass the buck on to other people if you don't do it properly, right? So it's very important that when we look at solutions, we are looking at solutions that fit the way these vehicles operate. For 14 years, this car is going to be on the road, or an average lifetime of a vehicle on the road is 14 years. Almost every part in that vehicle is going to get changed out. So, the Right to Repair Act also says that I should be able to change my own parts in my vehicle. I don't have to go to a dealer or an OEM to get parts. I can get replacement parts from somewhere. So how do those operate? It's a symbiotic environment, right? So we have to think about that aspect also. So it's very hard. It's hard. It's hard problem.
I agree with that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I agree with that. And I think, one of the things you can look at with it is, and it's one of the things that we've actually started investigating, was the idea of creating a software lifecycle management system that allows you to go ahead and centrally control that. So something goes to a dealership and you're changing out a part and you have to work through it. You can actually rescan every piece of APK that's going into the system. You can rescan everything that's going through and making sure that nothing's working poorly as that new part comes into the system.
Yeah. So, and one of the, I think if you look at most really successful or more successful hacks, it's oftentimes, one little vulnerability and maybe something like a subcomponent of a much broader system, right? And in the automotive space, you have such huge supply chains and all these companies and all these parts. Securing all of it proactively, it seems like can often be very hard, although as you've described, there's a bunch of techniques and philosophies and approaches to that. One of the really interesting sort of ideas around cybersecurity is the idea that, you know, if you can't secure anything and everything rather, and maybe nothing is completely hack proof, then maybe in some cases the best you can do is hope that a good guy finds the vulnerability first. And this has given rise to bug bounties and things like that. I'm just curious, in your experience, is this something that's working in the automotive space? We know it's worked elsewhere, but does that work in that to help sort of fill that you know, the gap created by all that complexity in a car?
So you can hope all you want that a good guy finds it. Typically, mostly when a researcher finds a finding, normal practice is you go to the source and you explain to them what you have found. And so you discover and you share that, because the purpose is, again, this is a researcher purpose. Motivation is to be able to make the system better. There are cases where, you know, they will not do that, especially in the data realm, because they want to extract information. I think that it is very important that we recognize that nothing is 100% hacker proof. Nothing in the cyber attacks cannot be avoided. We have to embrace it. We have to say that given infinite time and resources, every system is hackable. It doesn't matter which brand name tag is on the vehicle, every one of them is hackable. We have to embrace that. What we have to do is we have to increase our cyber resilience. We have to increase the robustness of these systems so that in the presence of an attack, this system can stand its ground long enough that the attack is either detected and or the system can respond to mitigate the attack, so which is a response, or it can alert another system up there in the cloud, in the sky somewhere, that, okay, you know, something is going on here, and we can hot patch, we can hot fix, we can do incident response, we can do some kind of triage and come after the system so that there is not widespread damage. You know, you get the 0 day, but then you save everything else after that. So those are, so long enough, you hold the bastion long enough that there is something else constructive that comes out of it. So cyber resilience and robustness, I think, are the key. We cannot prevent, we cannot stop attacks, we cannot, you know, we cannot do that. So that's the key, is build robustness into your systems.
Yeah, I see.
Oh, go ahead.
Actually, let's go with Brad first. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree with Anuja 100%. The main thing that you have to remember with these systems is that they're not servers, they're not databases, they're actual physical systems. So if you can hack into these systems, you can cause actual physical damage. You can drive into a building, you can drive into a car, you can drive into pedestrians. You know, this is very real. So when she talks about resiliency, you also have to focus on safety as well. So when these vehicles get attacked, how do you make sure that the vehicle stays in a safe state? Whether it's braking, driving to the side of the road, how do you avoid that? Because at the end of the day, if these systems are resilient from a cyber point of view, where basically the code still runs, but they drive into a pedestrian, that's not enough. When we design these systems, they have to be safe. And I think that's the most important thing that we have to remember about it.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'd love to get your view on this too, but I'd also see if we could work in maybe one of the questions we got from AAA Insurance, which is sort of maybe the role of cyber insurance, which might be another sort of systemic resiliency piece of this in a way, not really, you know, I don't know, how does that play into that, do you think?
So I actually, let's start with the insurance question first. I think insurance has a role to play in creating a more cyber resilient automobile, and actually more cyber resilient world. Just like they've had an effect on how automobiles drive and what happens with legislation across automobiles, they can do the same thing with this. That's a very powerful thing to say, hey, we can reduce your risk, but you've got to follow our rules. And traditionally, insurance companies have a tendency to look for the safest route into something. So you can play that where they actually have a very big role in ensuring that we're creating cyber resiliency within automobiles. That we are, and I'd say probably the biggest challenge that I've seen in it, because I think there's two things that go back to your initial question. The biggest challenge I've seen as I've watched cyber come into the automotive industry is it's a mindset challenge. It's really falling into the hands of the safety engineers, and the safety engineers are doing a lot of building out the cyber challenges. And the only problem with that is when you build a car to be safe, you build it within a set parameter of physical conditions, and those physical conditions don't change, and then you can actually warn a customer if you go beyond these physical conditions, the automobile is not going to behave in a safe manner. The difference with cyber is that every time you build something, every time you try to fix something, every time you patch it, there's an intelligent thinking being on the other side of it trying to break it, actively trying to break it. And that's a very different dynamic than safety. So I fully actually agree with all the comments that were made as far as, creating resiliency and looking at this as a safety issue, not just as a security issue. I will say that one thing the auto industry has done very well is, they started the ISAC a few years back. And that was a bold move for them. It's by no means the last move that needs to happen. Like, there needs to be a lot more than just an ISAC, but creating an information sharing resource, and taking a very, very competitive industry and saying, hey, we're not going to compete on this particular issue because it's just too important. That's a very big step forward. And it's something that, quite honestly, some of the industries that we look at as far more mature in cybersecurity took them a long time to get there. It took banking a long time to get there. It took defense a long time to get there. So I think it's actually a pretty good move forward for them.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are over time. Thank you so much to our audience for their patience. Unfortunately, we could probably have continued to discuss this for another couple of hours. It's a fascinating and huge realm. But thank you so much to our guests for taking the time and coming to share their expertise with us. Anuja, Sonalker, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was great. I enjoyed it. I didn't realize where the time went. Sounds like part 2 and part 3 coming.
Yeah. And Dr. Bradley Potteiger, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. And finally, Jeff Davis from BlackBerry, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And that wraps up our panel for today. Thank you so much for attending. And we have another fascinating panel coming up next week. I think you'll, especially if you found this topic interesting, I think you'll really find this next one interesting as well, as it has to deal with what safety really means in autonomous vehicles. It's a term that gets thrown out a lot, but we don't always know in material terms what that means. We discuss some of those from a cybersecurity perspective today, but we'll go even more in depth next week. So we hope you'll join us then. And thanks so much for watching.